with either. So what I'd like to talk to you today is about augmented reality and indirect perception and illusion. So I was trying to think of some basic issue in perception that's probably particularly relevant to augmented reality, and that would also be quite relevant to ways we might be manipulated by augmented reality. And this is the cluster of issues that I've decided to hone in on. So the key thought is this: if we think of AR scenes as being composed of overlapping virtual and physical objects, and we probably should think of them that way, then indirect perception is key to understanding this, including key to integrating, understanding how we might integrate the virtual and the physical, various kinds of perceptual illusions, to the sense of reality or unreality of AR scenes, how real they seem, and to a number of broad scene distortions that we're probably most cognizant of when we're thinking about the broad consequences of AR, distortions that might enhance or harm our lives in various ways. And so the conclusion for me is that people interested in understanding how AR can be used to manipulate users should understand this basic perceptual landscape and how it applies to this domain. And so I'll introduce the framework that I'm thinking of, setting aside virtual stuff entirely and apply it to some illusions. And then I'll apply it to VR worlds. So I'm thinking of those as digital worlds that you might access through VR glasses, in which case you'd have an immersive VR experience, but you might access the digital world through your computer screen or smartphone screen or your television. And then apply them to AR, where we have a mixture of physical and virtual objects in the same scene. And with that as a baseline, applied to some of these overall scene distortions I think might be of interest. Some of them you might have thought of, some of them maybe you haven't, and even for the ones you thought of, hopefully you'll find them interesting to think about given the framework that precedes it. One quick philosophical caveat: I'll be using lots of philosophically loaded words like perception and direct and indirect and illusion. And I'm not going to, I know, and philosophers of perception who are on the call know that there's a lot of debates about how to precisely characterize these things and consequences that they might have that you might want to avoid and so on. I'm sweeping all of that under the rug and going to leave these at pretty intuitive levels and explicate them mostly through applications to cases that I'll be mentioning. So happy to try and answer questions of the deeper philosophical sort on these concepts, but I won't be answering them in the talk. Thanks. Okay, so what is indirect perception? Well, you can roughly think of it this way. It's perceiving one thing by virtue of or through another thing. And for me, it can occur within perceptual experience or conscious perceptual states in a variety of ways. I think there's at least three basic ways that are quite different from one another. It can occur due to intervening transparencies, intervening representations, and intervening occlusions. So I'll give you examples of each. And I can give you examples of each drawn from everyday life. Obvious example, I hope, is viewing things through windows or different kinds of filters. In many cases, you can perceive the window, you know it's there, and you see some of its features, but you can also look through them to the distal scene, to some trees and foliage, and the nature of the window might enhance your ability to see what's beyond them, or it might distort, in many ways, your ability to see what's beyond them. So the window's between you, you can see it, and it's playing this mediating role. So it's reasonable to apply a notion of direct and indirectness in terms of your perception. You're more directly perceiving the window than you are the scene beyond it, the tracks and the foliage. Outside of windows and filters, you can get this with volumes as well. This is not the scene that scuba divers want, but it is the scene we sometimes get when we get down there for a while. And with perceptions of light and shadow, there's lots of instances of volume light and volume shadows where you can get a very clear transparency effect going. And I would suggest that similar terminologies can and should be applied here. Okay, all of these phenomena can be found throughout our perceptual lives without difficulty. An interesting limiting case here is where you have an intervening transparency, but it's perhaps effectively perceptually invisible to you. So if you have a window, this is the best image I could find that might illustrate this. If you have a window that's perfectly clean, it's not reflecting any visible light at all, it's otherwise just not noticeable, then it might be perceptually invisible to you, even though it's there and it's playing some kind of mediating role in your perception. Some controversies about how to understand the case, but if that's accurate, then this notion of direct and indirect perception wouldn't apply in that case. Okay. And the same would hold for analogous instances involving filters and lights. With regard to representations, here we're thinking of objects that represent other things. Obvious examples might include your television. So this television is representing some mountains. Maybe it's real time, maybe it's not, it's a static image. And various other things are represented in the bottom third of the television. Naturally, smartphones are capable of doing this as well. You can easily extend that idea to pictures, to images of various sorts, perhaps even to paintings and drawings. Controversies about how far we should extend these things and what differences start arising when you do so, but I'll skip over those. So in all these cases, there's what you might call the represented content, the thing that's represented, and it might be terribly real. It could be a live football match or a live view of those mountains. It could be as fictional as you like, composed entirely of fictional objects, abstract entities, things that don't exist in our world, perhaps not in other worlds as well. I think in general, you experience both the screen and the content. Some people might disagree, but I'll run with it. You experience both the screen and the content. And so in a sense, the screen is more directly perceived than the content. And the content relative to the screen would be indirectly perceived. This sort of direct indirectness is quite different from the last case with the transparencies and different from the next case as well. But you can see enough commonality to apply the distinction yet again. While this phenomenon, I think, is rare in natural environments, maybe it happens a little bit with reflections on water, for example, but in our human-made environments, this happens throughout our perceptual lives all the time. Third case is occlusion. There's different kinds of occlusion. Occlusion generally means blocking something. I'll focus in on one case that's pretty intuitive. So this cat, you can see this cat, and parts of it are visible to you, and other parts of it are hidden by the fence. I take it the parts that are visible to you, you don't experience that as a collection of disparate cat parts. Instead, you experience this as a whole cat, where part of the cat is occluded by the fence. So there's a kind of completion effect that your perceptual system is doing. And that means there's a sense in which you are perceiving the occluded bits, even though they're kind of out of view. And so you can take a similar kind of terminology and apply it here. You can directly perceive the visible front-facing bits, and because of this completion effect, you can indirectly perceive the bits that you kind of can't see but are being filled in by your perceptual system. Again, a very different kind of direct and indirectness than in the representation case and in the transparency case. And this phenomenon as well is found throughout perception. Okay, all of these can give rise to different sorts of illusions. An interesting case with regard to the transparencies is when the intervening transparent item kind of fuses with the distal opaque item. They get fused together and you don't see them as distinct elements anymore. So here's one example that can happen with illumination. The top left-hand image is a control image. You see a shadow across some grass and some pavement. And perceptually speaking, I suggest, and we can debate about this if you like, but I suggest you can kind of see that the shadow is not like one and the same as the pavement and the grass. It's a distinct thing that's on the pavement of the grass. In the other cases, that's not what's going on. The lighting effect is getting fused into the surface colors of the objects. So if you look at the top right, you see a brighter orange building here and a darker gray building down here. And it almost looks like they stopped painting it partway through. Maybe they're on break and coming back. And in fact, what's happening perceptually is this is a sunset. And so some orangish red sunset light is blasting onto this building, and it's generating this effect whereby you can't tell that it's sunset light. It just looks like it's fused into the surface. So you have a kind of illusion arising from a failure to tease these elements apart. Similar thing happening here. These two surfaces of the wall are identically painted, but because of straightforward lighting effects that you can find throughout your home, they don't look that way. And perhaps most interestingly, most compellingly, this case at the bottom where we have these circular purple and orange and yellow discs. Those, you just see those to be blotches of color on the ground, and in fact they are colored shadows. So it's a kind of shadow effect that generates colors. It's kind of hard to do, and this artist did it and wanted to make an illustration of it. Okay. Other examples with regard to transparency, I'll give you another quick one because I find it quite interesting. Here you experience a blue disc in the middle of this image, and I suggest if you think about how to describe the disc, you can see that behind the disc is a white surface. So the disc is in front of or on top of a white surface. So that's a transparency effect that you're getting. And the illusion here is that to the extent that any of this image is blue, the only bits that are blue are the blue squiggly lines that you see. So all the blue squiggly lines have blue, and the rest of the blue disk is filled in by your perceptual system. So your perceptual system is filling in a transparency effect, and is filling it in and generating a transparency effect. Okay. Obviously, outside of color, you can get illusions with transparencies involving shapes. Various window distortions can do that. And quantities, you can see more things than there are. And with regard to representations, if we switch to illusions there, the options are effectively limitless, because all that has to happen is the item that's doing the representing has to represent the thing that it's the content. It has to represent the content in some inaccurate way. Right? And there are effectively endless ways that this could be done. But to take some examples, it might make something look older or younger, lighter or darker. We're all familiar, whether we've used them or not, we've heard of filters available on Instagram and TikTok that can adjust qualities of images associated with beauty. And naturally, deep fakes, which many of us are now worried about, are going to exploit this kind of approach in a really deep way. With regard to occlusion, there's some nice occlusion illusions that we can point to as well. Here's a well-known one. If you haven't seen it, great. Today's your lucky day. This footballer's arm looks to be very long. In fact, this arm segment here belongs to this footballer, but because of the way his shoulder is occluded and this lines up, our visual systems are doing the wrong thing. They're kind of joining together this arm segment with this arm segment to make it look like a long arm. So it's an occlusion illusion effect. Here's a different one, even more powerful. We've got a collection of T's and Y's, and I guess this is an E and maybe a backwards E. So here's some shape segments. If you occlude these empty strips with patches, the shape segments change, your perception of them, changes quite dramatically. Now the shape segments look like they're joined together. And if they're just shape segments, then the joining effect is an illusion effect. Occlusion is also involved in some instances of impossible objects. Here's a somewhat complicated impossible object. It should strike you immediately as something that just can't be made to work when you try and work it out. Some of the reasons it can't be made to work out, a lot of them have to do with occlusion effects and multiple occlusion effects, how they overlap and generate the impossibility. Okay, so all forms of these three forms of indirect perception, the transparency, the representation, and the occlusion, can occur throughout our perceptual lives and generally do. So if you wanted to generate realistic VR or AR, then that's going to in part depend on how well you're getting these sorts of phenomena right, because these phenomena are found throughout our perceptual lives. Attempts to generate AR and VR virtual scenes, virtual worlds that look realistic to us are going to have to get them fairly correct. Getting them wrong might make virtual objects seem unreal or fake. And I'll give you a couple examples of that in a minute. Furthermore, indirect perceptions can be manipulated in a variety of ways to yield different forms of illusions. I haven't talked about whether these are good or bad. I'll leave that to the ethicists, but presumably it opens up the question. And so I think that VR and AR designers and people thinking about the consequences of these things should care about this stuff. So I'll give you some highlights of that. I'll apply the model I just gave you to VR worlds. Again, these are digital worlds that you might access through a virtual reality headset, which would give you the immersive VR experience, but you might also access them through computer screens and smartphones and televisions. I'll be using the computer screen version today. It's not hard to get transparencies and occlusion in virtual worlds. So this is an image from The Last of Us 2, a game I would like to play someday. Quite like The Last of Us 1 and Last of Us 2 came out, and my son was 6 months old, and there it goes. Sitting on the shelf. Nonetheless, this should look like to you to be a pretty realistic looking scene. It's a virtual scene. This is a virtual world. And some of the reasons that it looks quite realistic I put to you is because we've got a lot of good transparency effects here from the fog and from smoke and from lighting effects. We've got occlusion happening throughout in really compelling and straightforward, but because of that compelling ways. So think back to the cat case. Here we've got part of the building, and here we've got another part of the building. We don't experience those as building parts. We experience that as a complete building. That's because our perceptual systems do that filling in. But for our perceptual systems to do that filling in, the bits, the different building bits or cat bits, they actually have to line up in the right kinds of ways. So you have to balance that with care in order to get the perceptual systems to generate the right kind of output. So these kinds of phenomena are essential to a scene like this looking real. There's lots of representations in virtual worlds naturally. So this image is from Cyberpunk, another game I haven't played and I think I want to. We've got lots of screens that are representing things in this virtual world. And naturally, there's a number of transparency and occlusion effects here also. And when indirect perception is done less well, the virtual scenes tend to seem less real. So one example of this that I'll give you comes from ray tracing technology. I'm sure many of you have heard of this. This is I don't know, on the technical side of things, I don't know what it involves, but it's a software that allows much better rendering of how light would look in real scenes by kind of tracing how light rays would bounce across scenes. So you can see the technology is off on the left and it's on the right. And clearly there's a lot more gloss and reflective information on the right-hand scene than there is in the left-hand scene. And that alone might make you think the right-hand scene looks more realistic. You might object and say, well, the left-hand scene just kind of looks more dark, doesn't look less realistic. And to some extent, that's true. A couple of things to think of in reply. I do think that this light here looks quite animated in comparison with this light here, which looks quite a bit more realistic. I also think that if you wander around, spend some time in the dynamics of scenes that are dark like this, that they just don't look all that realistic in comparison to scenes that have lighting effects that are much closer to what we're used to getting in our everyday world. Okay. And then when it comes to illusions, of course, all the examples that I gave you in the last section, there's nothing preventing these from being found in virtual worlds. Well, let's apply this to augmented reality. I've argued that the different forms of indirect perception, the transparency, the occlusion, the representation, and the related types of illusion can all occur within physical scenes. They can all occur within virtual scenes. So within augmented reality, the scene is composed of some virtual and some physical objects. And you might want to think of it as Neil described AR. So we've got, by default, transparent lenses and images on those lenses that project virtual objects into the physical surroundings. Or you might want to think of it as the mixed reality Neil described, as I think Facebook uses the term, but the scenario where you have virtual reality glasses that give you a real-time image of the scene, but then make adjustments. I think everything that I'll say will be consistent with both, but I'll say up front that in my head, I'm thinking mostly of the first one, where by default the lenses are transparent. and augments are being added to it, virtual augments to the scene. Okay, so can these kinds of phenomena occur between the virtual and the physical objects? And in theory, sure, why not? Right? We don't have the technology yet, and maybe it's some decades off, but there's nothing preventing it from getting there. This is an image from ad for Microsoft HoloLens 2. I've got it here thanks to Neil, and I was playing around with it this week to get a feel for how it's working. This image obviously doesn't show you what it would look like if you were sitting beside someone with HoloLens lenses on. It's supposed to show you what it would look like for the person with the lenses. And we've got this virtual screen here. And this approach to AR is a kind of heads-up display approach. It displays some information that's relevant to the user, and that information is kind of disjoint from the surrounding scene. It's within that space zone, but it's not really integrated with the surrounding scene. Instead, it's more of a distinct virtual thing that contains some useful info. I think of it as a heads-up display kind of phenomenon. Obviously, it's pretty straightforward to see that occlusion happens within this scene, especially as it's rendered here. The image of this person represents this person, and if this is a real person, it's representing a real person. There's no problem there. Is there transparency in this scene? I think we do get some at the bottom. I think this strip is somewhat transparent. It's hard to tell given this rendering, but certainly I can tell you when I was wearing the HoloLens 2, a lot of what I was experiencing was very transparent. Different weird levels of transparency what I wasn't too used to. Someone's not muted. Oh, I think it's Adam Carter. Adam Carter, can you mute yourself? Cool. Certainly, when I was doing the HoloLens 2, a lot of what was being rendered was quite transparent in interesting ways that I wasn't familiar with, and I would like to spend some more time with. Okay. I'll set aside now the heads-up AR kind of model and switch to a more advanced AR where the virtual elements are quite integrated with the physical elements, perhaps to a point where you just can't tell the difference between them. So could you tell the difference between them? Let's suppose not in a good scene. So I told you this was a virtual world, but suppose this is a physical world, right? This image is compelling enough that if someone told you this was a genuine image, you may well believe them. Suppose this is a virtual world, with the exception that the fog and the smoke and this car over here are virtual. So the smog and the fog would be virtual transparent objects in front of physical trees, and the virtual car would be participating in a number of different occlusion effects. It would be occluding parts of the physical world, and it would be occluded by parts of the physical world. There's nothing preventing the AR from getting that advanced, and to get stuff looking realistic like this, it's going to have to do a good job of implementing these different kinds of indirect perception and direct perception. Okay, with regard to representation, this too is an image from Cyberpunk, and so this is the digital world. But suppose this is a physical world. Suppose this is a physical skyscraper, with the exception that all the representations and advertisements are added by your AR system, by your AR glasses. So just supplements on the scene in different spots, some representations. Okay, so obviously no difficulties imagining an AR system doing that. And when these direct perception effects are done less well, the virtual, by contrast to the physical that it's embedded in, is likely to seem less real. I predict that. It's hard for me to find good examples of it, but I was able to go back to the original AR, maybe it's not the original AR, but it's a classic AR, Roger Rabbit, and look for images from Roger Rabbit where it just looked like some of the effects weren't working well. And I think this is one. Roger looks like he's kind of in the physical space of the scene, but in a way, to me, he strikes you as a very animated, not real character. And part of the reason for that is because the lighting effects are not matching what is elsewhere in the scene. We've got a bunch of bright light coming in from the left and a lot of shadowing coming in on the right. And maybe those happen to match up perfectly with the occlusion that the man is putting onto Roger, but I don't think they would. And there's some lighting effects on Roger that don't match the scene, and Roger's just overall quite dark compared to things. So it really looks to me like he's a fake thing that's been put there, an animated fake thing as opposed to something that's compelling. And that's because one kind of direct and indirect perception just isn't particularly well rendered here. Okay. Naturally, the different kinds of illusions that I gave, they can arise in hybrid, augmented virtual scenes. There's nothing preventing us from doing that but technology and our imaginations. Right. So the physical footballer, well, suppose that this footballer's arm is actually pointing down and occluded by this other footballer. And this arm segment, instead of being physical, is just a virtual arm segment. Your visual system would do the exact same thing as it's doing now, and it would prompt you to see those two segments as joining up to a long arm. Right? So a sophisticated AR system could do that for fun, but you can imagine a system that knew the kind of assumptions regarding occlusion and completion effects that our perceptual systems use and find ways to exploit them, to manipulate you, to do things that are interesting, to trick you in different ways. Okay. So all forms of indirect and direct perception can occur between physical objects. Faithful renderings of indirect perceptions generally increase how real virtual objects seen against physical ones. And the related illusions can, in theory, occur between virtual and physical objects. I just gave you one example of the illusion. I could give you others, but I want to make sure that we have some time to look at some more broad-based perceptual possibilities that this kind of framework gives rise to. So some of these possibilities you've probably thought of, but I hope you start thinking of them in a new way with the kind of framework that I'm providing in line, and maybe some of them you haven't thought of at all. Okay. So a straightforward, simple case, low-hanging fruit, as it were, is color tint. This would be where an AR system adjusts the overall color tone of the virtual and physical objects in the scene. Could do for both the virtual and the physical. So the scene might be made brighter, might be made a higher color temperature, desaturated, the sort of effects that you get on your image processing software on your smartphone, but applied to the virtual scene. Applied to an augmented scene. Are there uses for this other than nicer effects? Sure, there's lots of uses. Right? Items of interest could be made to pop out in different ways, perhaps due to things that you're interested in, perhaps due to the interests of some marketers drawing your attention to things and drawing your attention away from other things. You can get many sunglass effects in theory. So I grew up in a very sunny part of the world. We had sunglasses on hand all the time and different kinds of sunglasses for different conditions. Not so much here in Glasgow. So an app that could do different sunglasses may not be downloaded very much in Scotland, but in other parts of the world could be quite useful. Perhaps on a more serious note, we know that our sleep and morning routines can benefit from the right kind of light information coming in. I turn my blue light filter on every evening on my phone. You can imagine AR systems exploiting similar knowledge and doing that to full scenes that we're in. Maybe having blue filters in the evening and full spectrum in the morning. And more deeply, you know, the people who suffer from seasonal affective disorder do so in part because they live in polar regions where in the winter months there just isn't a lot of light, and it affects their mental health in straightforward ways. AR systems could do things not just involving sleep and morning routines, but everyday routines that help combat this. Similarly, with depression more generally, there are a number of people who report the world looking gray, and to some extent, we think that this is perceptual. Things might actually look grayer to them, perceptually speaking, and so an AR system could make adjustments to the grayness of the scene and help combat that, and perhaps that could alleviate their depression to some degree. On the other end of the spectrum, some people are quite sensitive to intense perceptual stimuli. This is quite common on the audio side, where some people tend to get overwhelmed by audio signals, but there's some of it on the visual side as well. And you can imagine an AR system that knew about this for the individual being able to keep it in check and help the individual cope better. So all of these would at least involve virtual transparencies and maybe some representations or occlusions, depending on how it was rendered. I also think it's worth thinking about genre effects. So I think of generic world types. In an advanced AR system, The system could embellish your surrounding scene with a variety of things to give it a look that you want. I happen to like sci-fi, and so maybe there would be an app that could take my physical surroundings and embellish it in a number of ways that make it look like a sci-fi scene. It couldn't violate the physical parameters in general, like it wouldn't want me to walk into a wall or think there's a wall and I'm about to walk into when there isn't one, and so on. But if you think about it, most of the things, if you're walking around outside that you can see, you don't actually come into contact with. So there's quite a bit of flexibility on the part of an augmenting system to distort the shapes and sizes and molds of these things to achieve a variety of visual effects. If you're not a fan of sci-fi, you might be more of a fan of fantasy. When you're driving around, it might be that you want a specific world type as opposed to a generic one. Perhaps you're into Mario Kart. Your insurance company may not be. Perhaps my son would like a Charlie Colorform City app. So if you're not familiar with Charlie's Colorform City, it's a very creative Netflix animation series for children. And the idea is that Charlie is in a world like this and he's confronted with problems. And to solve the problems, he comes up with a story. And to execute or help the story unfold, to get the narrative going, he manipulates different parts of the world. And the outcome of the story arc and the world manipulations is a solution to the problem that we started with. There's a number of different levels of creativity that are at play here that I think is quite worthwhile for my son. And so a very, very basic Charlie Colorform app could just make the world look like Charlie, but a more sophisticated one might indicate ways that Charlie might manipulate this scene to do things, and an even more sophisticated one still might respond to challenges that the child is having and help the child see or think of ways of manipulating the world to achieve an outcome that might solve this problem. Obviously, if we've gotten that far, users would be able to build their own worlds, right? Their own augmented worlds. All these examples would rely on various forms of transparencies, representations, occlusions, and illusions. I didn't try and pick all those out, but I hope you get at an intuitive level that they're all going to be in play. And one of the things that maybe is good, but maybe is also terrifying, is that if this were to get going, it could be that different people would be in the same physical scene, and that scene would look very, very different to them. Or different groups of people, the sci-fi group walking around town, everything looks sci-fi versus the fantasy group. And so on. Why is that somewhat off-putting? Well, it would, in a way, take us out of direct engagement at an intuitive level, I would say, with each other, because we would be seeing things quite so differently. You know, we know now that there are these gravity wells on the internet where you get sucked into one part, one way of accessing information, and it's hard to get out of. It's possible that these sorts of things could help bolster that in an AR context. Quickly, spatial distortions, probably around a couple of minutes over time. So the AR might adjust the geometry of the scene, making some parts of the scene look larger or flatter. A relevant piece of background is there's decent evidence that our perceptual systems themselves distort spatial properties of perceived scenes. So at this image on the right is an experimentalist rendering of some results they've gotten, showing at roughly 10 to 15 feet the kind of visual compression that's happening in the geometry of a scene. And so the outside rectangle, A, C, E, G, H, F, D, B, that's supposed to represent the physical parameters of the space in front of the subject. And then when they measure the perceived locations of things and try and map that, so the perceptual geometric space, that seems to align more with this trapezoid, dotted trapezoid in the middle with the size on it. And so you can see quite a bit of compression pushing inwards and a whole lot of compression pushing toward the subject. We, of course, live with this. We don't often realize it. Maybe we never realize it. But if this data is right, maybe it isn't, but if this data is right, then that kind of compression is happening. And at further distances, we're pretty confident that depth gets compressed quite a bit. So you might want an AR system that can undo this, that can give you a more accurate spatial representation of the geometry of the scene. Why? Well, you might just find it valuable on its own. Engineers, architects, and planners, when they're, instead of having to visualize how things might look in different ways, they might find this quite useful. On top of that, they still find useful some orthographic projections. These are renderings where the internal parts of an object are accurately rendered relative to each other at the expense of some of the projective look of it. So they might find that geometry manipulation is useful for a variety of ways they could do it in the scene, instead of trying to just imagine what it might look like and trying to write things down. Similarly, on a perhaps more practical note, people do often underestimate how far things look, mountaintops and the other sides of lakes. If you're an experienced climber, if you're an experienced swimmer, you know this, you've learned this, and you make sure that you don't make the mistake. But sometimes people are less experienced and do make the mistake and get themselves into trouble. And even for experienced persons, they might just find it useful to be able to switch and see a more accurate rendering of the spatial parameters of the scene. Okay. Finally, person perception in the last 2 minutes. Key piece of background here. If we're going to talk about ways person perception might be distorted in AR, it's obviously an unlimited bag of options, but I'll hone in on a couple of things. Key piece of background is that we've got good reason to think perceptual experiences are somewhat influenced by background beliefs. There's some controversy over this, but I'm going to assume that the evidence is pretty good and just run with it. An important example is with color perception. So things with characteristic colors are perceived to have more of those colors. Bananas look more intensely yellow than things that are yellow but aren't characteristically yellow, so something that just happens to be yellow. Cucumbers look more intensely green than green things that just happen to be green. Right. So you can imagine a sophisticated AR system that could adjust perceived properties to reduce or enhance these kinds of existing perceptual biases. Could just be fun to do to see bananas and cucumbers more accurately, but there could be more serious relevant benefits for us. So to take one important example, perceptions of skin color. With that background in mind, there is some evidence that faces with features characteristic of white faces are perceived to be lighter than faces with features characteristic of black faces. So assume that data is good data. We're not going to make any inferences about how this impacts the ethics of people's beliefs or behaviors, or I'm not as a philosopher of perception. I'll set that aside. But you can imagine an AR system, because we're able to measure this, to get this result, we have to be able to measure these things. So you can imagine an AR system that exploits those measurement techniques and figures out for you the extent to which your visual system has these kinds of biases in it pertaining to color of skin. And once it detects that and measures it, it could offset it, counterbalance the bias. There's also now some short-term evidence, some evidence that these sorts of influences, these sorts of effects can be found through short-term training. It's not clear that it lasts very long, and the evidence is preliminary, but supposing this is going to work out, some short-term training could help untrain the extent to which your visual system has this bias, and maybe a series of short-term trainings on a regular basis could regularly recheck it and help recalibrate it on its own. Who knows? AVR systems could obviously be used for less positive purposes here. Right? Could homogenize presented racial features, can homogenize beauty features or do various things to them and so on, can block unwanted persons or segments of society. And I'll leave you with a couple examples of blocking that you might be familiar with, and even if you are, would like to revisit, I'm sure. They're both from Black Mirror. So in the episode Men Against Fire, soldiers are implanted with AR systems that do a very specific thing. There's a race of individuals that are being captured and killed within society. And when the soldiers are confronted with persons from that race, the AR system kicks in and makes them look like this. Naturally, and unfortunately, when the soldiers see individuals looking like this, it's easier for them to see these persons as threats and easier for them to capture them and exterminate them. Similarly, but differently in Black Mirror, White Christmas, it's not about soldiers, it's about everyday life. Individuals can block others from seeing them. So one example, the beginning of the episode was a divorced husband and wife who get into a fight, and the wife blocks the man. And so the effect of that is he can't contact her digitally, but also if he's in the same room as her, he can't see her features. He instead sees a static version of her through an AR system. And at the end of the episode, a gentleman who's convicted of a number of crimes by the authorities, his ability to perceive people are entirely blocked and given this static effect. So his world looks like this, which is quite horrifying to me. I'm not sure I'd want the authorities to have that kind of power, but they do in Black Mirror White Christmas. Okay, so quick conclusion. AR scenes are composed of overlapping virtual and physical objects. I think distinction between direct and indirect perception is key to understanding this, including to understanding how they might integrate various perceptual illusions, our sense of the reality and unreality of segments of the AR scenes, and to broad scene distortions that can enhance, harm our lives in a number of ways. So I think those interested in understanding how AR can be used to manipulate users should understand this landscape. Thank you.
Eric, would you like me to field questions for you?
Sure, Fiona, go ahead.
Okay, folks, so first of all, yeah, thank you to Derek for a really super rich and interesting paper. If you'd like to ask a question, could you send me a direct message in the chat just with a Q in it, and I'll field questions and ask people to unmute themselves and ask a question. Oh, great. So, Cotty, would you like to go first?
Thank you. Well, one question that I have is about the alter the sort of the tint of the world, like the sunglasses, or make the world a bit less gray or something like that. So I think that some of the thing that you envision there is not really indirect perception, but altering your perceptual system. So I was reminded of the fact that my mom told me when she had a artificial lens implanted in her eye because she had cataract, and she reports that with that eye, actually everything looks bluer. That if you cover the other eye, which has the original lens in it and the artificial lens. So in that case, I think there is no sense in which she perceives the lens, but the lens is part of her perceptual mechanism, and that alters the whole experience. So it seems to me that there is a kind of continuity between putting a filter, and then you indirectly see the filter, and through that you see the thing, or I'm not sure the glasses, whether the glasses are indirect perception, what's more like the window, or it's more like an alteration of my perceptual organ, and then the contact lens, and then the lens implanted. You can see how this could be on a continuum. I don't know what you think about that.
I think lots of things about it, and that's obviously a very valid case, and something I explicitly steered away from due to time. For the record, my two natural eyes have slightly different colors of the world. So this one, things tend to look a little bit more reddish than the left one. Something I noticed from a very small age, and I certainly wouldn't say that implies a kind of indirect perception. With regard to the lenses, right, a key question is something like this, because they're so close to you. Like I've got lenses in front of my eyes right now. It's clear that they're playing a mediating role, but is it possible that they're strictly invisible, kind of the way that the transparent glass is strictly invisible? Or is there a sense in which their manipulative effects are robust enough that they can be counted as something that's part of what it is that you're perceiving? So I take that to be a real question. And I've been thinking about ways that you might argue in both directions, and at the moment I'm unsure. I think there's a real sense in which I'm not seeing my glass lenses at all, and you might not be seeing augmented reality lenses. They're invisible to you, and you're just seeing the content. But there's another real sense in which, especially when I'm thinking of AR glasses, the glasses have all these features on them that sure are important to the virtual features. There's lots of shapes and colors and motions of things on the lenses that are directly relevant to the virtual objects that I'd be seeing projected out there in the world. So that kind of connection between the lens features and features which aren't anywhere else, by the way, or if they are, I'm not sure, maybe they're in the digital software world that Dave might talk about, but features that aren't obviously anywhere else in my perceptual environment, that pushes it in the other direction for me, that there's a sense in which these virtual objects should be understood in a way as perceiving some of the lens features. So if you go that route, then maybe I can keep the direct indirect perception going in that case. And if you go the first route, then maybe we give it up.
Eric, I'm keen to move on because we have a lot of questions and not much time. So my sense was that gave Cotty a good sense of where you were going with it. So Maximilian?
Thanks very much, Derek. That was great. So that's a follow-up and clarification. So that distinction between direct and indirect perception, I was wondering whether there is any such thing as a direct perception, because you said you perceive something indirectly when you perceive it through light. And I thought that rules out that we would ever perceive anything directly. And also our eyeballs are lenses as well. And the related point is whether you think, based on your answer to the first question, what the relation is between indirect perception and accurate perception.
Thanks, Maximilian. Both tough questions. So in theory, if the intervening items are strictly invisible to you, if the lighting effects and the medium of air is strictly invisible to you, then given what I said, you could just directly perceive distal objects. In practice, I don't think that ever happens. In practice, I think it's much more complicated than that. So some kind of indirect perception akin to the transparency sort, not akin necessarily to the representation sort or the occlusion sort, but akin to what happens in the transparency sort. I think something like that is the default perceptual state for vision. I won't argue for that in detail, but I gather your intuitions can see how we might get there anyways. Right? And your second question was, with regard to accuracy. Yeah, so I mean, it's complicated. In the representation case, I kind of sketched out how accuracy is supposed to go, right? If the representation does a good job of presenting features of the represented, then you can get a lot of accuracy, and to the extent that it distorts them, you get inaccuracy. In the case of occlusion, we can get accuracy and inaccuracy, but there's a lot of rules at play for when it's going to work well and when it isn't. And in the case of the transparencies, if the intervening, I mean, one way that I tried to highlight where inaccuracies start coming into play is where the intervening and distal items just get collapsed or mixed up together. But it turns out that there's a lot of ways that can happen. So I just highlighted one of them, but that's for me a clear sense in which you're going to be going down the row away from accuracy. But by default, I do think there is a lot of accuracy going on with regard to all of these phenomena in our everyday kinds of perceptions. There are some illusions too, but there is a lot of accuracy happening.
Thanks, Derek. Adam?
Yeah, thanks, Derek. So I was thinking about the stuff you said at the end about person perception and blocking, and it struck me that blocking might have a very useful benefit in addressing a certain problem in law, where you have inflated and deflated credibility, inflation and deficit for testifiers in a courtroom. So imagine a case where, you know, instead of letting the white person, old white person with the beard testify, and we inflate their credibility of their testimony versus a minority testifying or something like that and deflating it. Imagine the jurors have AR that has the blocking feature or some version of the blocking feature that you described. Well, you know, now rather than to have their sort of distorted credibility that's a function of how the testifier appears, this could potentially be controlled for in a way that would be useful. I know blocking sounds bad, but I think this is a case where that could potentially help. Might be controversial, but I think I'd vote for it. Yeah,
I'm sure the lawyers from both sides would have it out, right? The prosecutor would want blocking and distortion that might favor the prosecution, and the defense would want it going in the other direction. So it could just generate a whole series of debates about which ones we should push for and which ones we shouldn't. But yeah, I take your point. That's a good application of it.
I'm going to try and squeeze in one final question here. Steve, you had a hand up.
Oh, yes, thanks, Fiona. I was really raising essentially the same point that Maximilian was raising, that that I can see the lenses in my eyes, because when I take my glasses off, the world becomes very, very out of focus. I know that there are some poor lenses between me and the real world that are in my eyes. So at what point does perception become indirect, since the eye is an optical instrument, just as much as any other optical instrument sitting in front of us? That was merely the same point that Maximilian was raising, which is why I dropped my hand.
Oh, I see. Derek, did you want to say anything quickly in response?
Sure, I'll quickly say we want to, at least the way I framed it, for it to be indirect, you have to perceive one thing and then perceive something else through it. And so the question in the glass case would be, to what extent do you perceive the lenses? It's surely clear that they're helping you see. They help me see a great deal. You're all just a blur now. But something that facilitates perception needn't be something that is itself perceived. Right? There's lots of processes going on in my neural system that facilitate my perception that I wouldn't say that I perceive. They're just things that are helping it. So whether the lenses are things that are just helpers, or whether they're actually things that are perceived, is the tough philosophical question that Kadi was asking, that I can see good arguments for on both sides.
Great.